One of my favorite pictures of my wife is a picture of a part of my wife. Let that sit on you for a minute. Right? That's not what you're thinking. It's a picture of her hand. This is when we were doing our mission trips to Kenya in Africa, and we were at the Methodist Hospital in Mawa, Kenya. So a couple of you know that place very well. We were there, and our mission team, would break up every day and go do different things. The doctors would go out into the field and do clinics, and some of our team would work on buildings, paint and fix things. And Prudy and I were on the team that went and visited in the hospital and prayed with the patients there. And when we were asked to do that, the missionary said something very, very important to us. A couple of things, really. He said, number one, he said, if you're going to do this, you can't just do it one day. He said, if you do it one day, you go in there, maybe you get your picture made with a patient, you send it back to your church, you feel good, they feel good, but it doesn't do much for the patient. He said, if you're going to do this, commit to it. Go every single day and visit every patient and get to know them and have a relationship with them so that when you pray with them, it has power. And that was great advice. So we did that every day. There was one ward that we went to, and there were people in there who were very, very ill. In fact, some of them were terminally ill. And when we went into that ward, we realized that a lot of them were older people, and they didn't necessarily speak our kind of English. They didn't speak Okie very well, and we didn't speak the languages they spoke. And so it was really a challenge. What do you do in that situation? How do you pray with someone when you don't speak the same language? And Prudy showed us. You go over and you take their hand. It doesn't matter what you say from that moment on. When somebody's lying in a hospital bed and they're worried about their health, and maybe some people are looking at them as, well, I don't know what they got, but I don't want to get it. And you go over and you take their hand and you share that kind of a touch, then there's something very powerful that takes place. And I think if I was in a hospital somewhere and I didn't speak the language of some of the people there, and someone took my hand and bowed their head and started to speak in a language I didn't understand, I would know exactly what was happening. That's one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had, to be in that hospital with the wonderful people of Kenya, who are magnificent people, and to be able to pray with them every day repeatedly like that. It was just incredibly powerful. But what really made it special was the touch. That's what made it transformative. We've been in the series by Gary Chapman on the 5 love languages, which, as I like to say, is 5 ways to say, I love you. Chapman says that there are these different ways that we communicate love. And while we all share some part of each of these languages, we all have a primary language. And you can go on the webpage for 5 love languages and take a test, and they'll tell you what your primary language is. I suggest you just go through the series, and I have a feeling pretty soon you'll know what your language is. Not only will you know your primary language, but you'll know the primary language of your spouse and your children and your grandparents and anybody that you're close to. You'll start to recognize the characteristics, and you'll know people in your family. You'll say, oh, their primary love language is gifts or words of affirmation or touch, etc. You'll start to figure that out. Now, Chapman's point is that we tend to share love out of the love language that resonates with us. So if my love language is words of affirmation, the way I'll share love with the people around me is through words of affirmation. The problem is that may not be their primary love language. And the point of this whole series is for us to start thinking about the people around us and identify and understand what says, I love you to them, and then to be able to share love with them in their primary love language. Last week, as we mentioned with the children, we were on words of affirmation, words of encouragement, compliments, things like that. For many people, that's their primary love language. You can give them diamonds, cars, big trips, fancy houses. They're never going to really experience your love until they hear it from your words. This week, we're on the love language of personal touch, and it's the same sort of a thing. You can share lots of words of affirmation with someone, and they'll receive that and feel good about that, but it'll never touch them in the deepest place of their heart if their love language is touch, until there is a touch that goes with it. Now, the Bible talks about touch a lot. It talks about how touch is misused sometimes. You read Bible stories about Tamar and the other Tamar and so forth. You go through all those stories about how people were abusive when they touched someone. And then there are very positive stories like today's story that Mary read about touch. Touch is like a superpower. It's like you're a superhero. You can use your superpower for good or for evil. That's what you have to decide and determine how to use the gift of touch. Now, I think it's very interesting when you think about how God put us together, right? Our human bodies are designed by the Creator to experience and share touch. That's how God put us together. So it's very intentional on God's part that we be able to experience touch and share touch. That's a part of who we are from the beginning. In fact, our first love language, in my opinion, is touch. As little babies and as small children, before we can speak the language, or know much more than mine and no, right? We experience love through touch, through being picked up, being held, being patted, being loved, and being cared for. So the love language of touch is very important to everyone, but it's especially important to some people. It is the primary way in which they experience love. And if you're one of those people, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You'll know that you have to have that in order to feel loved. I had a little lady that used to come to church named Mary Martha. How a mother came up with that, I don't know. But Mary Martha, she came every Sunday on a walker. She had all kinds of physical illnesses. But she would come, even when it was snowy and icy, she would come to church on her little walker. And one Sunday when it was really bad, and there were about 20 people in church, I said, Mary Martha, maybe you should have stayed home today. I wouldn't want you to fall. And she said, no, Pastor. And I said, why did you come today, Mary Martha? And she said, because this is the only place in my life where anyone ever touches me. Can you imagine that? Tells you a lot about what we ought to be doing as a church, I think. But there she was. She was willing to risk everything for the experience of having someone hug her or pat her on the back at church. Now, the story in the Gospel of Mark that Mary read for us today is really powerful, and it's especially powerful if you think about the context of how the story is set in the Gospel of Mark. Remember, all four Gospels are told from different vantage points for different purposes. They're very different books. Mark is written during a time of war when the Romans are doing their thing. Eventually, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and the temple is going to be torn down. Things that the Jews thought were impossible. Their nation, their religion, everything was going to be devastated. It was going to be torn apart. Remember, the Gospels are written looking back, right? So this is a few years after the time of Jesus, looking back. And Mark's Gospel is written, if you start to read Mark's Gospel, go home, read a little this afternoon, almost every story says urgent, or Jesus did this quickly, or Jesus was urgent in doing this. Because in a time of war, that's what you do, right? Everything is urgent. Everything has to be done quickly. You don't have time for anything extraneous. In fact, in Mark's Gospel, think about this. There is no birth story. Mark doesn't say anything about the birth of Jesus. You can imagine having Christmas Eve service and there's no mention of the birth of Jesus. Wow. But Mark says, I don't have time for that. I got to get right onto the crucifixion and resurrection. I got to drive that home. I got to make sure my people get that because of what's going on in the world in which my people live. So you have this gospel that I call the war gospel, in which everything's happening urgently and quickly and there's no time for anything, and the point has got to be driven home. Chapter after chapter after chapter works that way. Jesus appears in the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. He's baptized, and immediately it says the Spirit drives him into the wilderness to face the devil, to face evil. And that's what he does for the rest of the gospel. He's battling evil, right? Because they're growing up in a time of war. They know what battle is. With one exception. Everything's urgent and quick, with one exception in the Gospel of Mark, and that's the text we have for today. And it's like the clock has been running really fast, and suddenly it just slows down to where it's barely turning. You may remember the context. Jesus is out in the area of Judea, right, southern part of Israel, and he's teaching. And it says that the crowds have come together around. And the crowds are all there to hear this great teacher speak. And then Mark says that some Pharisees have come to challenge Jesus. Now, the people hearing Mark's gospel know that, because they're looking back, they know that everything these Pharisees represents is about to be destroyed. The temple will be gone. Jerusalem will be gone. These very Pharisees are going to be driven up to the Sea of Galilee, and their city there is going to be destroyed by the Romans and buried under earth and not found until about 2008. Okay? Right. So they're looking at this, and they think these Pharisees are pretty bad guys. And the Pharisees, Mark says, have come to trap Jesus. And what's the best way to trap any pastor? I shouldn't tell you this. They'll kick me out of the union if they know I told you this, right? It's on the subject of marriage and divorce, right? So that's what they do. Because they know that if Jesus kind of toes the real straight line about it, then he's going to hurt people's feelings who have been married and divorced. They also know that if he takes a more open view of that and says that divorce is permissible under certain things, they'll be able to say, oh, but here's what Moses said, right? So they think they've got him in a trap. And Jesus handles it beautifully. It's a painful topic, a lesson for another day, but he handles it beautifully. And as soon as he finishes that, and he just defeats the Pharisees with his way of explaining all of that. Then it says people began to bring their children to Jesus for a blessing. And that was the tradition then. You would take your children to a rabbi, a teacher, for a blessing. Kind of what I did with Ben a while ago. You know, he would hold them or pat them and say a blessing for them. Now, one thing, just a sidebar I want to mention here, for all the dads, grandpas, uncles, etc., coaches, scout leaders today, this task was always performed by men. This was the responsibility of men, to make sure your children were in the presence of religious teaching and that they were blessed. That's not today's sermon, but you got a freebie there. I just want you to have that. And for all the guys here to keep that in their heart of hearts as they think about things and about their children, their families, Vacation Bible School, youth ministry, and that sort of thing. This work was done by men. Now, in the story, you remember they come and they bring their children to Jesus. The English translation is so polite. It says they brought their children. In the actual Greek of Mark's time that he wrote it in, it was written in for him, it's not like that. It's that they were urgently bringing their children to Jesus. Think about, again, everything in Mark is urgent, fast, got to happen right now. They were urgently bringing their children to Jesus. They were probably pushing and crowding around him and trying to elbow their way in and forcing their children out upon him. And the disciples say, no, we're not having this today. Get back, go away, take your children and go away. And it doesn't make sense, does it, when you first read that? Because we think Jesus is sweet and loving, and we're reading the story backwards. We already know that he's going to bless the children. So it doesn't make any sense, but you have to think about how the disciples looked at this. The people were seeing Jesus as a rabbi, a teacher. And the tradition is father, grandfather, uncle, take the children to the rabbi for a blessing. But that's not how the disciples saw Jesus. The disciples, and it'll continue to be a problem for them throughout the gospel, the disciples see Jesus as a king, right? He's the king. They're visioning him. Here's the one who's going to be the king. He's going to lift Israel back up. He's going to drive these nasty Romans away, and we're going to be a great nation again. So you don't just walk up and slam your baby in the hands of the king, right? You don't come to the king unless you're summoned. You don't approach the king unless the king asks you to come. No matter if the president is a Democrat or Republican or whatever, you probably won't be able to walk up to the White House and say, I'm here with my baby and I need the president to hug him and tell him how much he loves him. It's probably not going to happen for you unless the president calls you to come, right? So that's how the disciples are viewing this. They're looking at this hierarchy, and here's this hierarchy, and Jesus at the top, he's the king. We're the princes, and these children are just noisy, and they're all at the bottom. Some churches look at children that way. Didn't say that. Don't record that. Take that off the tape. Anyway, right? And Jesus says, wait a minute. Let the little children come unto me. And then it says some really interesting stuff. He says, unless you become like a child, you can't enter the kingdom of God, right? We know that passage. These disciples have been arguing over who gets to be in the kingdom. What does it mean to be in the kingdom? The Pharisees were arguing, if you're divorced, you get to be a part of the kingdom. The next thing that happens, Jesus is going to talk to rich folk. If you're rich, can you be in the kingdom? That's what the whole context is. And Jesus says, you got to be like a child. And what that means is a child will walk up and be touched and long for a touch, to feel accepted, to feel protected, to overcome being rejected, and to experience love. Now, once again, the English translation doesn't do us a real justice here, because when we translate things from the Bible languages into English, the translators are very polite, very nice people. And they don't want to be too shaky about things or too scary about things. It says here that Jesus began to touch and bless the children. What it actually says, what actually Mark dictated was that he began to fervently and passionately bless the children. Now, I don't know if you know what that means, but I had a little grandma about that tall from Chattanooga. She grew up in England, but she spent her young life as a young adult in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and became very Southernified. And whenever a baby was born in our family, it didn't matter if you were in a restaurant, in church, and the preacher was preaching. If she saw that baby, she was going to grab that baby away from you. You might say, oh no, he's a little croupy. She didn't care. She's going to grab that baby, hold that baby, pat that baby, pray for that baby, and tell that baby how beautiful here she was. And didn't matter if it was in the middle of the street, didn't matter if the buildings were falling down. She was going to do it. And I see Jesus here just like my little old Southern grandma. He is blessing these children passionately. He is pouring out his love upon these children. And in the Bible, remember this in Scripture, we've talked about this before. In the Bible, a blessing is always passed with a touch. No touch, no blessing, right? Go back to several of the Old Testament stories. Go back and read about Jacob and Esau. But that's how it's done. So Jesus is touching them and holding them. Some of these children aren't old enough to speak yet. The word that is used in the Gospel of Luke for the children here is a word that describes infants and children up to about 2 or 3. Mark doesn't use that word, but Luke does. So these are very young children, probably prelingual, a lot of them. So how does Jesus communicate to them not only his love, but the love of his Father? He does it by touching them. By touching them, by holding them, by blessing them with his presence. You see, because touch is always about acceptance. And go back again, think about the whole context of the Gospel of Mark. It's about who's in, who's out of the kingdom. And that's the debate that's going to be going on all throughout the Gospel of Mark. Well, you're a disciple, we think we're in, we're pretty good. Jesus says, no, I'm not so sure about you guys. Well, we're rich, we're powerful, we're successful, we think we're in. Jesus said, no, I'm not so sure. Maybe you should rethink that. Here, Jesus touches the children, and the symbol is of acceptance. The touch, the language of touch, is always a language of acceptance. It's about letting someone into your intimate space and showing them your acceptance. And I can be very concrete about that. When my wife Prudy and I were married, way back 250, 300 years ago, whatever that was, she had 2 young daughters when we got married, right? And you hear all the bad stuff about step-parents, and step-parents, we get a really bad rap, but that's the case. And so when we got married, even though I grew up in a family that was very touchy-feely, kissy, huggy, all that stuff, I didn't do that with the girls. I kept a distance because I didn't want to be that creepy guy. And I can remember when each one of them, as young ladies, came and hugged me the first time. It's decades later, and I can remember that feeling as if it had happened this morning. That feeling of love and acceptance, something they did without saying anything, that said I was really, truly a part of their lives and a part of their family. Touch is always about acceptance. Touch says, I accept you. Jesus touching the children is saying, I accept them. They're a part of my kingdom. The second thing that's true about the love language of touch is that there are times when words aren't enough. We all love words, and those of us who have a primary love language of words of affirmation, words are critically important. But even people who are like that, have to admit there are some times when words are not enough, like our experience in the hospital. There are times when only a touch can communicate love. And it's true for all of us, especially true for people who that is their love language. Some of you know that one of my favorite books is by Richard Seltzer. He's a surgeon, and he wrote a book called Mortal Lessons, in which he reflected on his life as a surgeon, that experience of literally being inside of people's bodies, trying to mend their brokenness and heal them, and his experiences of God in that process. One of my favorite stories that Seltzer writes is about a touch, and a very special touch. And I think it perfectly illustrates what we're talking about today, how that touch is such an incredibly powerful love language. The story goes like this. He had just finished surgery on a young woman, a young bride. She had a tumor in her face. And while removing the tumor, he'd had to cut a major nerve in the face. And it left her mouth crooked and twisted. The story takes place when he's in their hospital room with this young woman and her husband, and he's just told her the results of the surgery. It saved her life, but not her face, not her smile, not her lips. There's a long pause, Seltzer says. And then she looked up at me and said, "Will my mouth always be like this?" Dr. Seltzer nodded. He said there was a silence. Then her young husband looked at her and smiled. And he said, "I like it. I think it's cute." Seltzer said at that moment, there was nothing I could say. You don't speak in the presence of God. Seltzer said, I watched as this young husband bent over his wife, reshaped his lips to match her lips, to show her that their kiss still worked. The Word of God, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. As United Methodist